Good morning, everyone. Thank you for accommodating my less than ideal entrance time. So I had to get a few things set up, and so I appreciate your grace with that. I'm Melissa Usiak, and I'm here to just kind of support learning and learners in the transformation zone. And so we're going to talk a lot about how professional learning can help you do the work that you need to do. So we had this subtitle of the why, what, and how. It's not that easy. That's a really simplified way to think about professional learning, but hopefully you're going to walk away with some really strong reminders and some new learning around how you can shape opportunities for the people that you are leading around this work and around whatever work is important to you as far as what your data and what your evidence is saying is a need in your particular area. I'm going to apologize, I'm not having a really good hair day, but it is better than last week's, where I mistakenly took the antiperspirant thinking it was dry shampoo and put it in my bangs and had to go with the bun and no bangs with a headband look. So it's a step up, right? Yeah, I'm like, so at lunch, we're all going to start the letter writing campaign to Dove to please ask them to change the cans because they look the same, and they should look drastically different, let's just be honest, because they don't do the same job. Some of you guys don't even know what I'm talking about. It's okay. It's all right. So, yeah, I knew you did. I knew you did. You are. I bet you 99% of the time you have a great hair day. All right. Well, good morning again. I'm Melissa Usiak, and I do see a lot of familiar faces, which is lovely for me to come back to a place where I have worked with some of you. And today's topic is something that we've talked about in the past, but I'm hoping that we get to go a little bit deeper and that now your application is really contextualized based on where you are with the transformation zone. So a little bit about myself, just so that you know where I'm coming from and you know that I come with a really authentic purpose to help you do this leading learning even better than maybe what you're doing now. So I was a middle school teacher in the Okemos area. I only mention that because at that time, 20 plus years ago, it was a pretty affluent area. It still is. It's had some demographic changes, but it was a pretty nice gig to teach there for 7 years. And so as a new teacher, not too hard to acclimate. I think our biggest worry were that the parents that thought they knew more because they were highly educated. But getting a chance to teach 6th grade and 8th grade English and science was a real blessing. While I was there, I went to Michigan State to earn my master's in K-12 education administration. Was really looking to lead a school. So I actually went back to my hometown in Charlotte, where I was the assistant principal of the middle school, and ended up having a lot of the same teachers that I had and my sisters had. And that afforded me a lot of really interesting opportunities to be the instructional leader, who I thought I was the instructional leader, right? So, but some of these very veteran teachers weren't quite ready for some of my ideas. So that allowed me to learn how to have some critical conversations. At the time, didn't seem like quite such the blessing, but it really taught me a lot. Most importantly, I really truly fell in love with the opportunity to help create systems to help students and support students that didn't really have equitable access to school. Because when you're a 7th and 8th grade assistant principal, you're really deemed with this responsibility of academic failure, truancy, and behavior. Right? Let's be honest. But we had some real old school practices and how we were going to work with those kids, and I had a chance to really kind of explode them and rebuild. And we did a lot of really awesome things to support those students. We were doing things that I think people are just now kind of trying out for size. Again, some of the work I've done in the past didn't feel progressive or innovative at the time because I think it was so hard and so grueling, painstaking. But I do think that we were trying out some things in this and in my other leadership position as well. So I had a chance to go to Michigan State and work on my doctorate full-time 2 years after I took that position. So I spent 2 years at Michigan State full-time, which was awesome because I got to be an instructional or a field instructor. So I was working with interns, I was teaching TE classes, I was working on research, and just getting really steeped in the theory that was awesome. It was not many people get a chance to do that out of practice, take that 2 years, and so that was a real gift. But I was really itching to go back to practice, and so I actually landed a job in Holt, which is south of Lansing, at an elementary school. I was there for 7 years. And in that 7 years, I got a really amazing opportunity to try the things that we're going to talk about today, because we were one of the first districts to have the early release Wednesdays, so really focus in on professional learning. The high school, secondary schools had been part of a research project with Michigan State where it was funded to start late weekly. And so then the whole district, after that grant and that research ran out, the actual whole district transitioned to that, and the elementary buildings would get out early once a week. So I got there in the midst of that, and I had already fell in love with professional learning and facilitating the learning of adults. And so I got a chance to try that out for size, and it was really, really fun and really wonderful. The second thing that was my favorite thing was, once again, I was in a position to create systems to help support students. We had a large change in student population of children predominantly living in poverty, and that was a really different thing for my teachers. And they really needed support in how do they serve a student population they hadn't served before. So a lot of the professional learning we did at first was all around how do we understand our students better, how do we reculture and re-mission and re-vision to really support students that we hadn't needed to support in those ways before. And then we hopped on the My Blissy. We ended up being a My Blissy school my third year, and that helped us create some RTI, now MTSS systems, and we did some pretty amazing things. I'm going to refer a lot to that experience because I want to contextualize things for you. It's not that I am a narcissist and I only know autobio. It's just that's the set of experiences, much like your own, that you draw from, and I just want to give you some concrete examples as we go during the day. So after 7 years, I had a chance to go back to MSU, and I've been an assistant professor there for the last 5 years. I am a professor of practice, so I'm not tenure line, which is kind of scary, but it's also a blessing, again, because I don't have to publish. I don't have to have the pressure of getting grants and research and writing, although I have colleagues who are kind enough to bring me into those projects. I don't have to run them. I get to teach, and I get to be that liaison back to practice, and I love that. So teaching in the master's and ed doc program are really, really exciting, wonderful work for me. In addition, I'm the executive director for Michigan ASCD, so ASCD Ed Leadership Publications you may have read from, so we're the Michigan affiliate. So I get to work with that organization, which is really wonderful. And then most importantly, no matter where I go, I like to develop leaders, and I like to help people think about building capacity. I want to build your capacity, and I want you to think about how you can build capacity, because having been a building principal, I knew I couldn't do it on my own, and I had to get really good at that. So I have some pictures to kind of represent kind of who I am. So of course my kiddos back at Sycamore. I actually go back weekly now and do some mentoring of a couple of students, which is really fun. And it gives me a great chance to be back with my staff that I miss dearly. But my students, they fill a bit of a void in working with the adults that I miss working with in the school. And then I have my kids here, and I keep a picture in my intro slide of them all the time because they are a constant reminder of why I've made the different choices I've made in my career path. And they really have stuck with me, and they were really patient through a long period of time where they didn't get a lot of attention. And my daughter will talk about when she used to get up when she was 6 at 6 o'clock in the morning just to say goodbye to me, because that may be the only time she saw me, and that makes my heart hurt now. But at the time, and I can refer back to it, is, I was really giving myself to a lot, hundreds of other kids, and they understand that now. But they've been on this journey with me, and I like to just honor them by keeping a picture of them. And then this one up in the top is a little vase. Again, it has the script Courage on it, and I received this from my self-contained special ed teacher at the end of my first year. And she was a veteran teacher, and I actually had her son in my very first classroom as a teacher. And she was so encouraged by the work we were doing, and she was learning so much as this veteran teacher, but she also saw how courageous it was to go back and have those critical conversations now at the building level, really nudging and pushing the district to allow us to do things that we needed to do to take care of our students and our families and our community. And so those critical conversations came back full circle. And they're on their second principal since I've been gone. She just started, and she asked one of the veteran teachers, why is there this reputation that like Sycamore's always fighting? Not infighting, but like fighting with the district. And she's like, that's not fighting. That's just Melissa's legacy of advocating. They just thought she was fighting, but she was really just advocating strongly. And so I know I had lots of really lovely labels and names throughout my 7 years in Holt, but you know what, it was worth it. And again, I'll refer back to that experience as we go. So just a little bit about myself. And again, I'm here to help you. I'm here to advocate for your learning. And I'm really, really hopeful and quite sure that you're going to walk away with some, again, strong reminders and some new ideas to make application to your current work. So you can count on me today. These are my working agreements I like to establish. I'm going to give you some current materials and resources and examples. We are going to continue to stay super positive about our environment. I think that just makes the learning that much more fun and easy. I'm going to be open to your questions. I know a lot about a few things. I don't know a lot about a lot of things. So if I don't know, I'm going to tell you I don't know, and I'm going to go out and find it, and I'll get back to you. I'll give you my best insight, but I'm not going to tout that I'm an expert in everything. I'm going to model a lot of protocols. So I run a 2-track agenda. If anyone's ever done adaptive schools training, I have an agenda. We have an agenda that we've crafted. So thank you to the MDE team, because we've been working on this since the summer, really being thoughtful about what you need and your responses about what you need. And so we've been crafting this agenda and this day for the last 3 months. But I like to model for you a lot of what I'm hoping you will do. And I will break and I will talk to you about why I made decisions I made, just like that student teacher and the cooperating teacher. I'm going to really go metacognitive with you and say, I made this choice because this is what I was thinking when I was planning. And so just again, to give you some insight to help you enhance how you're going to lead learning. I am going to use a turn and talk every once in a while just to keep you engaged and you processing in a maybe briefer way with like an elbow partner at your table. So that little icons to remind me that that's a time where I'd love for you to turn and talk. So there are a few of those sprinkled throughout the day. So this is what I'm going to ask you to do. I'm going to count on you to examine your own leadership. What knowledge, skills, and dispositions can we push on today? So maybe you have a lot of skills and you're used to working with adults and you're used to leading their learning, but maybe you need a little bit deeper knowledge based on the research and the evidence that you can share with them about why you're making your choices. I'm going to ask you to consider the shift from PD to PL. You're going to see PD in a lot of resources and a lot of references, whether that's in the state, in the literature, in your own professional documents, and that's okay. But I want us to think about how can we transition to this professional learning that's job embedded, it's authentic, it's meaningful, it's relevant. We're going to talk about some of that throughout the day. So just think about where in your mind are you shifting these ideas. And then, of course, ultimately, we want you to make application to your transformation zone work. I'm going to really encourage you, and I'm going to remind you at the end of the day to make sure that whatever groups you're working with, you have some sort of working agreements. You can call them whatever you want. You can call them working agreements. You can call them norms. You can call them I'll count on you, you'll count on me. But it's really important that you have these. When you set them up the way I did, I'm going to do these, you can count on me, I'd like to count on you. What do you think that does for the dynamic of the group? And some of you have worked with me before, so again, this is one of those things that you've heard. So now maybe you can think harder, how many times have you actually done this? Have you made some applications since you heard this last? What does it do for the dynamic of the group?
It turns it from being just listening to more interactive and everybody being responsible.
Definitely. So there's a shared ownership when we have a set of agreements that we can both try to abide by. Anything else?
It gives people a chance if they don't agree at the beginning to say,
Yeah.
I'm not comfortable with that one. But then later on, if there's a little layer of accountability, like it gives you a place to say, hey, remember we agreed on this?
Yeah, a little bit of a check, right? I'm sorry, that's my email. I'll take that down when you're doing your connector activity. Yes, there's some shared accountability and shared ownership of the learning or of the work during that time that you're together. So one of the things I like about the I'll count on you, you'll count on me is that it's not just me telling you you have to do these things, right? Like I put myself first, so as a leader, I'm putting myself out there. I'm committed to these things. Sometimes if you have, a set of like the 7 Ps from adaptive schools, that's, you're kind of telling the group that this is what I expect you to do, but yet there's not necessarily from the presenter or the facilitator any ownership. So this kind of creates that shared ownership. It's reciprocal. I'm going to encourage you, and there are some resources that I've given to the team that help you with this conversation. So that you can come up with some joint ones. But if you came up with them from scratch, you could wordsmith all day long. So there's a set of kind of a protocol with a bunch of suggested ones that you can start to narrow in on and then make agreement around. Again, we'll talk about these later in the day, but I like to pause and do that. The other thing I like to do is I like to keep a strategy harvest. And so what this is all the activities or strategies that I have selected, that we have selected as a team to keep you engaged, thinking, and processing. And so this makes my thinking, our thinking, really visible to you. And it also gives you an example of how many things, when carefully planned and intentionally planned, you can have throughout the day that really get people thinking aloud. And I can see that, and you can process with each other. So I like to keep a strategy harvest. I listed the first couple right away, but I'll keep adding to that throughout the day. Does anyone have any concerns or questions about our working agreements for today? Awesome. So we have some overall outcomes for the day, but then we have some section outcomes. So we kind of chunked the day by the what, why, how, all that. So we're going to review those mini outcomes, sub-outcomes as we go. But ultimately, we want you to think about, we hope that you will think about what data you can use to determine professional learning. And when I say data, I want you to think big, like think evidence, right? Because evidence, we think about different sorts of indicators, whereas sometimes data gets us really narrowed in on something quantifiable. And, which is great, we need that, but we also need evidence to layer on that. And so when I say data, let's think broadly and think evidence. We hope that you're going to develop a process for determining facilitation and training, and you get time at the end of the day. Again, the team wanted to be responsive to what you asked for, which is more team time, more planning time, more processing time. How can we make some application right away? So you're going to get that at the end of the day. We want you to think about, and we hope that you will effectively think about evaluating professional learning and utilize data for that decision making. So part of that professional learning is maybe learning how to use that data. And then we want you to ultimately, like I said, at the end of the day, develop a professional learning plan. And you may only get started on it. But one of the things we're going to talk about is authentic professional learning comes with support and follow-up along the way. That's the difference between a training or like a one-shot wonder or spray and pray. I'm going to spray it out. I'm going to pray that everyone understood and learned it. So the idea is that you have ongoing support from the team at MDE, and we think that professional learning plan will ground some of that. It's going to give you something to continue to come back to as you're partnering with them. And it also will help to guide your whole, your ideas throughout the year. What you write today is not set in stone. It's not, it can be adapted, but at least it gets you thinking across the whole year. So we wanted to open up with just the opportunity to revisit, just for a few moments, the RCA and DCA. Because what we wanted to do is we wanted to really be explicit about the parallel between what we're doing today around professional learning and how people scored themselves on these particular items here that are listed. And so we'd like to give you 10 minutes right now to dig back into your RCA, DCA. We've guided you with some specific items to look at, so you're not just wandering around that massive set of data. But honing in on these particular items, go ahead and look at how did you score? What are those areas that you want to hone in on and pay really particularly close attention to today to help enhance those areas? What questions do you have? Okay, so I think yesterday we started with 5, but people wanted a little more time, so let's go with 10. Okay, I'll check in with you in 10 minutes. I'm going to invite your attention back up here. Again, please know that this could be your whole morning, right? But we just wanted you to have just start the morning with connecting back to that, because you probably haven't looked. Maybe you have looked at it. Maybe you have multiple copies throughout your home and your office. I don't know, but maybe not. So we just wanted you to get a little bit into it to start to draw that connection for yourself, and so you know where to kind of hone in and where your thinking might be going. So that might be part of your content, is kind of drawing from there where you wanted to work on. But we've got a lot about process and a lot about tools and setting the stage for the rest of the morning. I want to point out, I listed up here, so one of the things that I've learned through some cognitive coaching and working with Amy Colton, who's the Learning Forward Michigan Executive Director, is when you ask a group, if they have questions, you frame it as, what questions do you have? And when you frame it that way, you all of a sudden drop that whole thing about, oh, well, if I ask a question, then am I going to look stupid? So you're assuming there are questions there, right? So you're kind of dropping people's maybe their tendency to not want to put themselves out there. When you put it out there like this, you assume that there are questions and you just welcome those in. Does that make sense? Yeah, so I just wanted to put that up there because it is something, I think it's subtle, but I do think it makes a difference, and it's just one of those strategies. So what you will notice if we dissected the practice profile, you would notice that professional learning has a presence throughout the entire MTSS practice profile. And I think that should be an indicator that it's important. It can't just be a standalone. It has to be embedded because it's embedded in the practices. So anytime you're asking a group to do something differently, whether it's an instructional practice, it's a routine around academics or behavior or working with families, we need to make sure that we are doing an adequate job and sufficient job of helping them learn why that's important, and that's professional learning. So there's a new book out, I'm going to refer to it in just a moment, that talks all about whenever you ask people to implement something, you've got to start with professional learning. You've got to start with how do they learn about this, why it's important, how they're going to do it, and then that's also connected to this ongoing support of it. And that's where we misstep when we think about like new materials we adopt. And we have the person from the publishing company come in and spend 2 days with our teachers, and then they're just expected to just know why they switched to that material, what that's going to bring them, how they're going to use it. Like, we just do a real disservice to that opportunity to engage with a new instructional material because we haven't necessarily thought of it as professional learning. We've thought of it more as training. So that's another example of where we've really fallen short and we don't necessarily do it well. So I'm going to start with we're going to continue with a connecting activity. Sometimes these are called icebreakers, sometimes they're called common ground. I like to make sure groups know why I do these because I'm going to encourage you to do them, and you should let your groups know why you're doing them. And here's why. I started being really explicit about why we were spending time in professional learning, connecting and grounding ourselves, because no offense, guys, I had a lot of guys on my staff, one at every grade level. It was just awesome, 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 but they always rolled their eyes when we came to this slide during professional learning. And I had to say, we spend time doing this because it grounds us. It pulls us together. I don't know what your mornings were like. At that time, I didn't know what their school days had been like. I pretty much knew that they were probably chaotic. And you got to kind of clear the slate, right? So you clear the slate, and you also create a space to build trust and relationships, which we're going to talk about in a few slides. when you want to build communities of practice, they're going to be that much more effective when you've taken time to build trust and relationships, and that takes time. And when you're the facilitator and you're honoring that as part of the process by taking time to do it, you're modeling for them what you hope's happening back in their classrooms, right? Building classroom community. So we do take time. They don't have to be long. And this is a really great thing that you can build capacity around. So eventually, when our leadership team got to a really great point of evolution, I could distribute my leadership and have somebody else develop the connecting activity and facilitate it. It gave them an opportunity to lead. It took one less thing off my plate. And so it really became some collective ownership. So I'm actually going to give you 2 minutes to do this activity. The person with the most buttons on today, the person with the most buttons is going to write down in 2 minutes as many things as your table mates have in common with one another. So find out who has the most buttons. Most buttons? Who at this table has the most buttons? You still counting?
I got a lot of buttons.
You got a lot of buttons?
Yeah.
See, the poor women with denim jackets on yesterday, they definitely had to hit the most buttons. All right, so you're it? Most buttons here? You wore the right dress today. All right, so I'm going to set my timer. 2 minutes. Just a second. Don't start, because I don't want anyone to have an unfair advantage. Go. As many things as you can find to have in common. Okay. All right, Clinton, what was one thing that you all had in common?
Because we're videoed right now. We all love to travel.
Nice. Very good. Excellent. Thank you. ISD?
Yes, we have all sat on chairs.
We've all sat, they got super creative. They've all sat on chairs, yes.
Wow. We are all married with children.
Married with children, awesome. So now you could see a couple things about this facilitation-wise. You could make this a little competitive, give a little honor to the group that had the most legitimate list. You could have the group pick one thing and talk, like most, we all like to travel, and then everyone talk about how they traveled. It depends on how much time you have, right? You can expand it, you can contract it. But I wanted to let you know from a facilitator standpoint, you all came in pretty happy. I can tell you like each other, and maybe some of your groups don't. And so, but whether they do or not, whether they're friendly by nature or not, it lightens the tone in the room, right? People are laughing, people are smiling, and you're sharing. And depending, again, you have to be conscious of your group. If they are a new group and they don't know each other well, talking about where they've traveled to, talking about what their favorite chair they've sat on, those may be good conversations for them because you want to help them build that relationship, because that will lead to trust amongst the group, which is going to lead to greater professional learning and taking risks in their own practice. So again, you get to decide with your facilitator hat on, expand it or contract it. But those are really important times of your agenda. What questions do you have about connectors or grounding activities, icebreakers? You can call them whatever you want.
Do you have a great resource where we can turn to see them in a book, or just gather them from ideas?
I just gather them from, I have looked because I wanted to be able to offer that, and I really don't. I just keep a nice running list. The Lipton and Wellman book over here, I'm going to share all my resources throughout the day. Can you get, yeah. So this Lipton and Wellman book, they are a little bit more, they're really protocols and activities that are meant to take longer, but some of them can lend themselves to, like there's one I think we've done before here in Lenawee County since last we met, where you have to decide what book title, movie title, or song title represents your life since the last time you met. And that can be a grounding activity, right? So you can pull from some of these other resources I'm going to share with you today and adapt them to make them a little bit briefer.
Melissa, I have a question on that.
Yeah.
So you're saying to use these throughout the whole meeting, not just as a regular icebreaker at the beginning?
It depends. I think you definitely want to start your time with them. If you're doing a day-long session, it's probably a good idea to do one at the beginning, maybe one right after lunch. We can talk about why after lunch. That might be a good thing to do. It really depends on the group. Again, as you plan and design a session with them, time is huge. It's a huge factor. Their dynamics is a huge factor. You don't ever want them to be distracting from the work. If you're going to use protocols to help them process and learn together and activate and discuss, those are more extended opportunities for them to continue this kind of a process and building that relationship. Protocols build relationships in and of themselves. So, but these smaller ones that are a little more lighthearted, that have to do with like personal things, them as people, not just them as educators, are really important, especially as you come together.
And so like when you're presenting to a group that maybe they don't know each other at all, I mean, we all work together.
Yeah.
So you think this would be?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I'll show you a couple other things too, a couple other tools you can use that will help. And sometimes, again, think about your group. Can they handle it in a whole staff? Or do they need to be in smaller groups to do this sort of a thing? Again, it can be either one, again, depending on time, depending on their dynamic. If they think they're going to be more comfortable in a smaller group or in pairs, have them start with that, and then you can grow it to whole staff. Good questions. Okay, so this is our section that we're entitling kind of the why. So what we're doing is we crafted this part of the agenda to model for you what we want you to be doing with your group. So we're going to spend a handful of moments talking about the why of professional learning. Why are we spending time talking about professional learning when it has to do with your MTSS transformation zone work? We want you to do that same thing back in your own spaces about the why. But it might be the why of having data dialogues. It might be the why of looking at student work. It might be the why of changing an instructional practice in a certain content area. All that depends on your evidence and data, but you've got to build the why. So we're modeling the why for you around why professional learning. Why are we spending time on this? But we know that that might not be your why back in your space. So these are those section outcomes. We said we kind of chunked up the day for you. So in this smaller section, we want you to understand why it's critical to consider adult learning principles and adult learning theory. And also, we really want to promote those practices that support professional growth and how they lead to student outcomes. So part of the why of professional learning is ultimately it's supposed to impact student outcomes and influence student outcomes. So we want to make that connection for you. So we're grounding yourself in some of this work. So you're justifying why you're spending all this time around professional learning all throughout the practice profile. Why is this important? I'm going to start with a little video. He goes on to say and make the point of he gave Daryl Huff the what, right? But when he gave it a purpose and he gave it a why, you saw an even more elevated version, right, of that singing. So his whole thing is you don't know what people are capable of in your group, but they got to have a purpose, they got to have a why, they got to have a platform. And that's part of the establishment of the professional learning and why we spend time on the why. So that is a video, like I said, that I use quite a bit and think it just can serve a lot of different purposes, and it's very entertaining, and it gives me chills every time I listen to it. So. All right, so I like to start with this definition of learning from Katz and Dack. Katz and Dack are a set of psychologists, actually, who wrote a book back in 2013 around professional learning. And it's called Intentional Interruptions. So it's this idea of how do you intentionally and deliberately go in and create some dissonance in adult learning. Because it's in that dissonance that people feel uncomfortable. Yes, that's true. Part of our job is to make people feel uncomfortable because otherwise they aren't open to change and doing things differently. But it has to be guided, it has to be very intentional and very deliberately planned. But they say that learning is a process through which there is a permanent change in thinking or behavior. So think back to a professional development or a training you've been to, where you might have like picked up a couple of things, but did it permanently change your thinking or behavior? Did it really shift your knowledge, skills, or dispositions? Because that's what we're going for. You guys have some really heavy, deep shifts to make in people's thinking to then influence their practices. And so that's why we want to be so intentional and deliberate with this professional learning, because just telling them to do it's not going to be enough. Just showing them a piece of data is not going to be enough. Giving them a manual is not going to be enough. It takes that much thought and energy and time going into how do you scaffold this for them. So this is Katz just recently wrote a book with Jenny Donahue. Jenny Donahue has written with John Hattie around collective teacher efficacy, which we know is getting a lot of airtime right now because it has a really high effect size. Because when you can create a group of educators that come together and have a shared belief in doing the work that they do, they collectively believe they can get better at something, that has a higher effect size than any other practice that John Hattie in his meta-analyses has identified. So that has to start, but that's a long, slow, arduous process, well worth it, but it doesn't happen overnight. You can't just get a group of people together and be like, okay, learn together and build your belief that you can actually do this thing that we're talking about. It takes a lot of time. So his book with Jenny Donahue just came out, and I've only read the first chapter with a group in Livingston County, but it's really a profound way to think about any time we ask people to change or implement, and implementing takes change, we have to provide the professional learning that they need and build that collective efficacy. So when things get hard, they believe they can push through, just like student self-efficacy. So there are a couple of adult learning principles and frameworks we can kind of just think about. And again, it's just part of your why. Why are we being attentive to the way adults learn? So there is a framework called Andragogy, which is the art and science of teaching adults. And that is similar to pedagogy, which is the art and science of teaching children. But you can start to see by this list, they are going to vary some. So when I teach a whole course in the summer around professional learning. It's called Leading Teacher Learning. At MSU, it's an elective class. In my perfect world, it would be a mandatory class. I think it's the most important thing we do as leaders is leading the learning of everyone in the organization. And so we talk about and we dissect pedagogy and andragogy, and they do a lot of comparison and contrasting, and they want to default to, well, adults just learn like kids. But really, they don't necessarily just learn like kids. So let's think about this. Adult learning best practices. There's a real world relevancy. It has to feel relevant. It has to feel urgent. That's where your data and your evidence, that's where your student need and your adult need come in. But if you look down here at some of these other ones, ego's a big factor in adult learning. Okay, adults have egos. And it's important that when we are building that relevancy and that urgency, we keep in mind that they might not necessarily want to admit that it's urgent because they need it, because they have ego. So we got to keep that in mind. We need to, but we can do that by honoring their past practice and their competence in those areas. So this is where it's really different than kids, right? Think about the decades more experience teachers have coming to learning than a fifth grader. We need to honor that in some way. We need to make sure that it's experiential. Are they trying? Are they doing? And that can't happen in one session. That might be trying and doing in one session, but then they try and do back in their own setting, and then they get checked in with. That's that ongoing support, that coaching throughout. Okay, you check in on them, you ask them how it's going, and you structure your professional learning to continue to check in those formal times as well as those informal times. You need to reduce the fear of judgment during the learning. So those grounding activities, right? Everyone being honest and transparent about who they are as a person, and you can really start to deepen that as you move through with that group. That's going to reduce that fear of judgment. You can't expect to bring a group together the first time and say, okay, what do you all suck at? Right? I mean, we got there in 7 years. We could be really honest with each other, but that didn't happen the first year. We have to come with feedback. And I'm going to get on my soapbox a little bit, and then I'm going to hop back on it in several slides. But the way that we are using the educator evaluation tools, even as efficient as they are, which is lovely because everyone needs to get this feedback every year now, emailing a checklist, it's not enough feedback. They need to be getting professional learning from that educator evaluation process as well as other layers of professional learning, and feedback needs to be deeper than a checklist. Just saying. It needs to be deeper than a list of wonderings and notices. That's great. It's great to start with where's the follow-up, where's the conversation, where's the dialogue. We've lost the art of post-observation conversations, and I know they take forever because I did them with a really large staff and the only administrator, but we've got to continue to think about that. Okay, I'll hop off my soapbox. It needs to be collaborative and reflective. So we've got to make sure we're building in opportunities for a community of practice to learn together and then reflect. So one of the things that we are going to do today is we're going to pause and we're going to ask you to reflect on each section. And then we're hoping that those reflections, you're going to be able to revisit them when you go to your planning this afternoon and be like, oh yeah, I want to pay attention to this. Oh yeah, this was new for me. Or this was a good reminder. So it needs to be reflective. And then again, that coaching is needed for transfer. We've invested a lot of resources in this state around coaching. It is not the only form of professional learning though, because that's putting too much pressure on one or two people in a system to provide all the professional learning. It's a piece of professional learning. It can't be the professional learning. So just keep that in mind. They should be involved. They can't do it all. So you've got part of your team from MDE that's going to continue to check in with you throughout the year and coach you and use those learning plans as maybe a point of reference, a common place to start the conversation. That it can't be just on them. So those are adult learning best practices to think about when we're thinking about these adults as learners versus kids as learners. So one of those ways that we can reduce the fear of judgment during learning is to make sure that we are continuing to build trust and relationships. Now, you may not be with that group every single day. They need to have an even higher level of trust and relationships, but you also need to have trust and relationships with those people, or credibility and honoring what you're bringing to the table is going to be a missing factor. So I just wanted to mention a couple of these researchers here, again, for the why. Why is it important? It's not just because I think it's important, because I experienced that it was important in my building, but because research says it's important. So Kruzis and Posner are a set of researchers that study leadership, just leadership in general, in all sorts of sectors. 30 years worth of, mostly survey data, some interview data. And what they've found is they've come up with this list of these leadership practices. And in one of their books, the sixth, in all their books they talk about trust and relationships, but it's number 6 in one of their books. And they talk about the fact that trust matters in leadership. If you want people to follow, if you want to build capacity, and you want to be that transformative leader, you have to know your people, and it has to go beyond a transactional A equals B. Oh, you come in at 8:30, you leave at 3:30, you get a paycheck on Friday, right? You have to make an investment in those people and get to know them. And they need to do the same thing. Shannon Moran she's also sometimes partnered with Hoy as a researcher, and they specifically studied trust in schools. And what they found is that when there is trust in schools, more learning happens. People are more collaborative, people are willing to be transparent, people are willing to exchange ideas, people are willing to learn together. And so trust in schools matters. And then we've got Breik and Schneider. They're pretty pinnacle researchers around trust in schools. They did a 3-year longitudinal study in Chicago public schools. We know what a large, tangly organization that is. And so across 3 years, they looked at all sorts of stakeholders dynamics, from students to staff to teachers to leaders to community members to parents. And what they found across that 3 years is that there was a particular kind of trust that was cultivated in high-performing schools, and that these schools that had relational trust had better student outcomes. And they describe relational trust as the day-to-day interactions amongst people that help them to really understand each other's roles and responsibilities and feel competent and feel like the other person's competent in those roles and responsibilities. Well, if you don't know what the roles and responsibilities are and you're not working on those through daily exchanges, you're not able to develop that. So I gave the team to put into the folder a one-page sheet on relational trust. Some of you that I've worked with before, it's still there. Might be something to revisit with a text-based protocol, just to talk about why are we spending time on these connector activities? Well, that's because we learned that if you build trust in relationships in organizations, you're more likely to learn together in effective ways. You're more likely to take risks like we want students to do in a classroom community. This was really important for my staff. I started out the very first year reading this and dissecting this idea of relational trust. Do not be afraid to bring research to your staff, even your support staff. They actually feel empowered, but they might be like, what, at first? But they're going to feel very empowered that you're investing in their learning in that way. So right down to my recess supervisors read relational trust, read about it. Just the one pager, that's all we started with. But what happened is that allowed us to have greater conversations when things got messy. So I'll give you an example. Recess supervisors, this is one of my favorite examples. Recess supervisors line up the third graders, and before the third grade teachers can get out, the fourth graders are coming out because the third grade teacher's late. And the recess supervisor is really frustrated, and the teacher comes out all exasperated, knowing that they're late, and they just they exchange this nasty glare at each other, right? They don't have to say any words because they know what each other's are thinking, right? So I had to I went back to relational trust, and I said, okay, classroom teacher, when you aren't out there on time, the supervisor is not feeling competent in their job because now they have double the kids, and they don't feel like they can keep everyone safe. And the kids are getting squirrely in line, and they're having a hard time, they're frustrated. But recess supervisors, you need to know that every once in a while the teacher's going to be late, because guess what? Even though it says in their contract it's duty-free, it's not really duty-free, and they're going to be rushed. And so I need you to understand each other's roles and responsibilities and lean into those when you need to. We don't want to take advantage, but you gotta go back to this. What are your daily exchanges? How do you feel, do you feel competent in each other's roles and responsibilities? So it was a really powerful piece of information for us to use. And again, but nobody had invested in recess supervisors and paraeducators in that way. But I'm telling you, once we were able to empower everyone on the staff, and we built that trust and relationships, and we knocked down those work group barriers, because those just kind of get created naturally because people have different titles. I don't like titles, I don't like labels. Then we really started to shift because we got collective ownership at that point. And I'll refer back to that as we go. What questions do you have about trust and relationships? All right, let's talk about the P in professional learning. So the P is professionalism, right? It's the profession. And I think it's really important that when we think about the P in professional learning, we're thinking about coherence. How is the data being used? How is the evidence being used to create a coherent acknowledgement of the profession? How are we using that to help drive the profession, not degrade the profession? And that's another thing I don't think we've done super well. And that's not just a Michigan issue. We are going to pause in just a moment to read a piece by Fullen and Hargraves, who are ad leadership researchers and authors. And they have dug into this idea of building professional capacity using professional capital. So capital is a real sociology term. We talk about capital with students when we talk about equity, we talk about the achievement gap and achievement opportunity. Well, we need to talk about capital and equity when we talk about educators as well. Before we do that, and we model a protocol, I'm going to just mention this other piece of research called Beyond PD. It's also in the folder that I've given the team. So this is, there's an executive summary that talks about this research. And this research highlights 4 countries who are high performing using the PISA, which is the international data set. So they're high performing, especially compared to the United States. But they also have a really different approach and structure to teacher professional learning. So they have a strategic approach that requires all professional learning to be developed around an improvement plan or improvement cycle in schools, and it's always to impact student learning. So they've restructured how they do professional learning, and what they find is that they get better student outcomes. So the countries are British Columbia, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Shanghai in this particular piece. And I'm not saying we can totally explode our school structures and systems in the United States. When I get Betsy DeVos's job, I'll do that. But right now, my sphere of influence is a little smaller. It's you all. So we want to think about, this could be a good piece to think about, what do they do differently? And so one of the professional learning designs that we used in my former school was lesson study. That's a Japanese model, and they have a really different school day and school year structure. So what we found is that we don't have the perfect structures for lesson study, but an early release once a week. We were able to adapt lesson study for some really powerful professional learning, and I'll speak to that later in the day. But this might be a good piece to look at and say, what are they doing differently? Most of all, they're connecting professional learning to a cycle of continuous improvement versus using continuous improvement as an event. They're making it a real process. But they also have some different structures too. So to dig into this, why do we invest in professional learning? So that you have a little more depth of knowledge about this, we're going to read this piece called Professional Capital. And in your blue, are they blue today? Are they green? They're blue? They're different colors? All right, in your folder, there is a piece that is called Reviving Teaching with Professional Capital. So I'm hoping that the 2 times we break to read today, you're finding that to be a real gift, because I'm going to guess you don't likely stop during your school days and read. So I'm hoping you take advantage of this opportunity to just be able to get into a piece of text. When you read this, you're going to read it individually. I'm going to give you, I want you to pick out 2 quotes. And that's all you're going to do for now. 8 minutes to read and note 2 quotes. You can highlight, you can underline, you can star, whatever you want. I'll give you that choice. But just select 2 quotes in the 8 minutes. What questions do you have? Okay, I'll set the timer for 8 minutes. We're going to move on with a text-based protocol called Final Word. You may have used it before. So in a moment, I'm hoping that the person on the end of the table, in just a moment, can pass out the popsicle sticks that are in front of them. Everyone gets a popsicle stick. What I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to ask you to create a triad. 1 color popsicle stick in each group. You're going to do a standing or sitting. You get to decide once you form your group of 3. You get to stand or sit. I'm giving you choice. And you're going to take your piece of paper with you, take your article with you, choose 1 quote. Decide who wants to go first. You can decide. The first person reads their quote aloud and talks about why that's important to them. Then the other 2 people in the group get about 30 seconds to comment on it. And then you go back to the first person. The first person has the final word, kind of responding to what the group said or any new thinking that they had. So you can see that this is about 1.5 minutes. This is actually because you only have 2 people in your group. We're doing a triad, probably a little closer to 1 minute. And then about 1 minute to wrap up. So each rotation is about 3 minutes. Now, when you use a protocol with the group, you decide how structured you want it to be. You might need, because it's new, you might need to be up here with your timer saying, go, stop, Okay, 30 seconds, go. Like you might have to really direct that depending on what the group needs. You may be able to give them a set of directions and just say, you need to be done in 10 minutes. We expect that you pretty much follow this. You might need to ask someone to have the role of timer. It depends on the nature and the dynamics of the group. You get to decide that. I'm going to ask you to just do your best to pay attention to equal airtime and follow the protocol. The idea here is this is the hardest part because people want to start to interject. They want to start to interject their ideas before the person's done. Oh yeah, like, oh, I thought that too. And really try to, again, the idea of protocols, the reason they're powerful is they get everyone engaged and they're structured. So when the group is new or even when the group isn't, it gives equal airtime and voice to everybody. What questions do you have about final word in triads according to multicolored popsicle sticks? All right, so you're going to each get a popsicle stick. You need a group of green, purple, and red popsicle stick. Once you find each other, you can stand or sit. Once it looks like the room is ready to go, I'm going to set the timer for 9 minutes. All right, everyone got their popsicle stick? So first of all, let's talk about the process. Why would I have you choose 2 quotes?
In case somebody chose yours.
Yeah, in case someone else selects yours. Again, depending on the length of the piece, I think they can pick 3 if it's a really short piece and you think they're all going to snag each other's, right? But it's so that people don't say, oh, well, you already picked mine, you've already discussed the same thing. You can vary who goes first. You can do the who's got the most buttons, who has the longest hair, who has the closest birthday, who has the highest heels, anything like that. That creates a little element of fun because everyone has to go first and then there's a laugh about it. Don't be afraid to read with your groups, right? Like this is, now you can read articles, which are really consumable. People aren't too intimidated by them. Excerpts from books. Don't ask me about copyright law. Book chapters, depending on your group. Now, you can ask them to read ahead of time, but what you should probably count on is not everyone's going to read ahead of time. So if you don't want to give them the entire time to read the entire thing, you at least want to give them time to revisit it. For some of them, it's going to be the first time they visited it. But build that in, so just be thoughtful about that. Not everyone's going to come having read, so have some time to skim and just remind themselves in case they did read it 2 weeks early or in case they haven't read it at all. So again, don't be afraid to read as a common learning experience. Read around the why. So if you're working on the K-3 instructional practices, take one and now do just put out 2 really brief pieces about informational text, and I can't remember what the other piece is. I have a graph from her on one of them. But those are really great places to establish a common understanding of what the content is with the protocol attached to it so they can start to process it before you start to dig into, oh, well, actually, our data says we need to be working on this, right? Or talk about the data first and then read. So reading something together is really powerful. So don't be intimidated by that. Use a protocol to help you anchor it. So a few more slides and then we'll take a break. So this idea is what we want you to really avoid in professional learning, what we really want you to embrace. So we didn't want to frame one as PD and one as PL because we want you to be open to the fact that in a lot of places it's just going to be called professional development. We need to shift our brains to the factors of professional learning and these standards of professional learning, which we're going to review in just a moment. So we want to make sure we're avoiding that it's disconnected from a career path. So trying to make sure that people's professional goals individually are aligned with the school and the district and the continuous improvement process, that it's aligned with student performance and student learning, that it's related to data and the improvement process. We want to make sure it's not out of context. So when I got to Sycamore and we all had these early release Wednesdays, I thought it was a gift. I had colleagues who it was a nightmare for them because they didn't love facilitating professionally because they didn't know how, they didn't have the skills to do it, and so they very much glommed onto flavor of the month. Oh my gosh, so-and-so's coming to, the ISD, we're gonna bring that person, we're gonna piggyback and bring that person in for an hour. Okay, well, is it related to what your data says you need? How are you gonna extend the learning? How are you gonna keep a job embedded? How are you gonna revisit it and reflect on it? That's also the one-shot wonders. Make sure you've got the resources dedicated to it. So I couldn't start lesson study as a learning design unless I was willing to set my resources into getting subs 3 times during the year for half a day. So teachers could be in each other's spaces and take turns throughout the grade levels to do that. So if I didn't have the resources, I shouldn't even start on that path if I don't have the resources to back it up. If you want to do a book study because you've established the urgency to learn more as a learning team around a piece of content and it's captured in a book, don't dedicate yourself to that if you can't pay for the books, right? And then make sure it's not individual, like it's not one person's soapbox or one person's platform, right? Make sure it's distributed, make sure it's honoring what everybody needs. And maybe that's everybody in a grade level or everyone in a school or maybe a subject area team, right? So it may look different by team. That's okay to individualize. But you can't have one person saying, oh, I went to this workshop and I learned all about restorative practices. That's awesome if your data says you need restorative practices and part of your mission and part of your improvement plan is social emotional learning. Please embrace that you want to make sure learning for teachers is established throughout their career. And so those mid-career teachers that they talk about in the article, you have to honor that experience like in those adult learning principles. Make sure it's aligned with student content and performance. There's evidence in the school improvement. Make sure it's part of a community of practice, a professional learning community. Thinking about problems of practice. Well, your data and evidence should lead you to that problem of practice. Make sure there's transfer with support. You don't just say, okay, go out and try this strategy. We'll see you in 3 months at our next PD day. If you don't have times established to check in with them, make it part of the evaluation process. This is what I'm observing for. This is what we're going to debrief about once I've been through in a walkthrough. This is what all my comments and feedback are going to be around. That's a way to transfer new learning. Make sure you allocate your resources and make sure you share that leadership. So after you build a team, plan with them. So you're going to plan together. That should be happening at the building level with leadership teams as well. I want to pause. One thing I didn't ask is, why would I ask you to read that article on professional capital? What does that have to do with what we're talking about today? Tell me more. Tell me more.
Well, like just the idea that like focusing on like the professional as a group will improve the individual.
Yeah, that individual capital to collective capital, right? This idea of using those sociological principles and applying them to the profession of education. And think about your sphere of control. You probably, it says mid-career teachers probably should get like a pay increase, right? Like that's not within, maybe that is within your sphere of control, but probably not. So go with what you can, which is you can create the conditions for professional learning and you can enhance that profession in that way. So just thinking about this idea of humanistic capital, decision-making capital, they're all really important factors in adult learning and in educator learning. So this is a slide from Susan Lallier, who has been an integral part of our coaching essentials. So she's helped us script what are those essential practices for our coaches. Whether they be literacy coaches, I think her coaching practices can be applied to other content areas. But she talks about, and she's growing the idea of professional learning and professional development beyond just coaching. Coaching is one model, and it's one way of support. But she says that professional development should lead to an increased teacher knowledge and skills, which should change classroom instruction, which should impact student learning. Only makes sense, right? Sometimes we forget this, though. We forget that it should relate to student learning, and we forget to measure and look at how these things compare and how they're supporting, are our practices in professional development effective? I added this Timperley diagram, which is really similar, and she talks about these black boxes as sometimes being void and sometimes being forgotten, but that there is this fluid process around this cycle. But the idea is you start with professional learning communities and they should impact student outcomes in a positive way. Or are we checking, is there no change? Is there negative change? If that's the case, we need to do some different stuff up here. But if we never check in with how is it impacting student learning, then we're not doing our role. And this is from one of Nell's recent publications. She actually also talks about effective professional learning, and that when we have weak professional learning content and weak processes, there's little hope of improvement. But when we have strong professional development content, so is it research-based, is it evidence-based, and we have processes, which is what we're talking about today, that's our best chance of improvement. But we can't get to student outcomes if we just say, here are the 10 essentials. Good luck. Okay, we've got to provide the learning to go with them. So these are professional learning standards that are actually, they were crafted by Learning Forward. Learning Forward is the professional organization all about professional learning. So I'm going to encourage you, that's a new resource for you possibly. Learning Forward, even if you're not a member, their website has a lot of really useful tools. But Michigan's adopted these. They are in our legislation that any professional learning that we count as professional learning is supposed to meet these standards. You may or may not have known that, but it's really important that you get in tune with them because they're based on the research and they come from Learning Forward. So not because they're mandated, but because it's good practice, most importantly. So let's talk about these just for a second and then we'll give you a break. So learning communities. We need to make sure that the learning for teachers and educators occurs within a learning community that's committed to continuous improvement and that it's collaborative in nature. We need to make sure that skillful leaders are out there leading the work and advocating for strong professional learning practices. We need to prioritize resources. So in the class that I teach, after they get into this why part, I give them a $3,000 budget and I say build a year of learning. $3,000 isn't that much. But it doesn't take a $16,000 presenter for a day to increase teacher learning, increase educator learning. They get a lot out of that $3,000 once they've figured out how to design professional learning across a year. Data. We need to make sure that we are using a variety of data to plan professional learning. Not one piece of data, multiple pieces of data. And we're going to talk about that later in the day. Learning design. That's how do we structure the time? How do we design the learning to maximize the opportunity for collaboration and trust and relationships and deepen the learning and increase the why? Implementation. So part of this is we have to consider change. People resist change. We have to think about how does it get implemented along the way. So we need to make sure we're applying the research on implementation. And we're going to talk about that again also. And then outcomes. So does it align with outcomes for teacher and student performance? So at this time, before we take a break, in your folder, there should be a sheet that says metacognitive reflection. There's a number 1. So this first chunk has all been about the why. We'd like you to spend just a moment reflecting in writing, because research says when you take it from your brain through your hand and you script it, that's a really strong reflective practice. We want you to respond to these 3 questions. What did you learn so far in this section? How does it apply to your own experiences with professional learning? Maybe it compares, maybe it contrasts, maybe it complements. And then how will this learning influence your work with your BIT or DIT moving forward? Love the acronyms. You have to say those really carefully too. So if you could take just 3 minutes, unconscious stream of thought. Always the same. So the dominoes is a fun way to move people around. And I wouldn't try to use too many of these all in one session, but you could use a different one each session. And then I have a colleague and I who use playing cards a lot with our students. And again, if you are really strategic, she's much better at planning it out than I am. You could like, okay, all the twos get together. Make sure you have one of every face in your group. So you have a king, queen, spade, club in each of so you can do it different ways, but the cards are a fun way. So I just wanted to mention that. And then Jennifer Stanchfield is the author of these 2 books, and she's come to Michigan ASCD the last 2 summers to do a day of experiential learning with educators. These books, I think originally she was really trying to help teachers learn how to create experiences for students to activate their learning. But what she found is that the adults were just as in need of being able to draw upon these experiential learning tools. So she wrote a couple of books based on experiential learning. She started out as an outdoor educator out west, where kids were just doing all the time. They were learning by doing. So she wrote a couple of books. She's got a really great website where she has a lot of her materials for sale. And so like little charms. And then she's got a set of like a protocol to go with the charms, or bookmarks, or these processing cubes that have questions on them. So she's got the protocol that goes with each of those. It's an investment. What would be great is if your district or your ISD had a set of these books as resources and a set of processing tools that you could kind of check out, and then you could share them. But I think that it is an investment, but it is helpful so that you know you want to get people out moving around, experiencing, processing, sharing, building trust relationships. If that kind of stuff is done for you, just makes it that much easier, and you don't have it as an excuse to not plan for it. So I just wanted to mention those as a couple tools and strategies. So we're going to talk about context from now until lunch. So the context of the learning in your organization. And I was listening to the middle group here talk about, but I don't want to wait to do that. You cannot wait for the perfect context. So Lois Easton writes quite often for Learning Forward, and she has her 3rd edition of Powerful Design, which is all about ways to structure professional learning, not in one session, but across time. And she talks about, in her 2nd edition, she's got a whole chapter on context, process, and content. And I actually have my students buy this book and the Lipton and Wellman book for the summer course, but I had permission to take those 3 chapters out of her 2nd book because I think that's a really good way to think about professional learning. So we're going to start with the context right now. And she says you can't wait for the perfect context. You can't wait for that perfect team where everyone has the accurate knowledge base or the leader that knows how to facilitate. Like, you just cannot wait. So in this section, we want you to, for our outcomes, think about the conditions for learning in your own context and understand why those are important to just know, no matter where you are. And then define key elements to evolve the current learning culture. And we're going to use some former data and some new learning to do that. So in your folder, there is a 1-page paper that has these 4 stages along the left-hand side. So this is to help you be a tool to decide where is your context, where is your group in their learning. So I want you to take just 3 minutes individually to take a look at the description for these 4 stages. You don't have it?
Not everybody gets it.
Yeah, I don't have it.
Okay. Who does not have it?
Who doesn't?
Are you sure? We think that extra? Okay, otherwise we can create a new form. Everybody's got more copies. So once you get yours, or if you have yours, just take 3 minutes to look at the descriptors of forming, storming, norming, and performing. Stages. This isn't stages of implementation, I'm sorry. We have the wrong title. This is stages of group development. The next slide shows implementation. Sorry about that. So just reading the stages of group development on that one page. 3 minutes. Thank you, Michelle.
Yellow.
Recently, that stage 1 can oftentimes be the storming part. There's a lot of, here's another thing, so that morale when something to do is automatically low. Unless there's an understanding, then we can
Yeah.
really start.
So often there's not like a reforming because there's not a lot of shift in maybe personnel or leadership or the people in the group, but the task doesn't cause you to reform, it causes you to restorm. Yeah, and that's part of that fluidity too.
Are there times when groups like skip over storming?
And go right to performing. I would beg to say that even if it's a brief norming, they're still going to have to norm, right? Those common expectations, it's hard to get to performing. Storm and then you have to norm, where you really start to have those shared expectations, you start to get into a groove. Even if your sense of urgency propels you to perform, I feel like there's likely a natural stage of that norming. Yeah.
Can I ask you?
Yeah.
The bottom part says when a group adds new members, it becomes a new group again, and that makes must return to first stage. In education, there's so much turnover. With that argument, how would you say things get done if we have to start over again?
Or I would even argue, or that's a good example of how things don't get done.
Yep. So it's really easy to settle in one of these first 2 stages and never move because things keep changing. You're in a constant flux and it creates a really complex situation. But I think that the more systems and structures you have in place, the easier it is to move out of forming and storming. And so even if you do have new changes in the dynamic of the group, if those systems and structures are in place to build trust, to build relationships, to catch people up on the system, on the organization, on those common expectations of that group, I think you can move quicker. I think that speaks to that really important piece of systems and structures. So for instance, if you have a calendar around when you collect data, how you look at data, what you do with data, and there's a new teacher, and we acclimate them to that calendar, they're going to form and storm and get to norm quicker. So you've said this is important. How often do you talk about this with your groups? How often do you acknowledge that this is a natural process for any group? I mean, personal or professional, right? Family, professional, friends, neighborhoods. These are natural. I heard someone say they align with the stages of grief, kind of, like you got this process of grief. We could also move to stages of implementation and align these 4 stages of group development, the stages of of implementation, and I apologize for the title there change. But how often do you stop and pause and assess and say, guess what, guys, we're feeling this way because we're here?
I think this happens all the time. You just might not think of it in that context. I mean, it's just
more commonly associated with just reflection as a whole.
Mhm.
I liken a lot of this to like athletic team successes. You introduce something new. There's
New
immediate
play,
satisfaction
yeah.
when someone doesn't understand
New
it.
position the player plays, yeah.
So this happens all the time. It's just, I never thought of it in this framework.
I think there's some power in being really explicit with your groups about where they are. So when you talked about knowing this helps you plan. So particularly storming. When people are storming, a lot of times they're not happy. And so a lot of their cognitive energy can go into not being happy. And so when they come into professional learning and something's new and they're storming, we can create the conditions for them to release some of that and give them an outlet for that, and then move on with common learning, acknowledge it and move on, or we can let it happen and consume us. Because it's going to happen in the bathroom, in the teacher's lounge, in the parking lot, in the hallway, or we can use protocols to capture those concerns, acknowledge them, say, I understand, I hear you, well, this is what we're going to work on and this is how, and then move forward. So that was a really powerful thing when 3 months after I got to my new school and everyone was up in arms because we now had like 75% of our kids that were living in poverty and they weren't coming with breakfast and they weren't coming with a jacket and their parents were returning phone calls. Very deficit, right? And oh my God, these kids, these poor kids and their families, poor us, woe is us. I mean, I let them whine for like 3 months. And then I was like, enough, I get it. We just formed a new community and now we're storming. We can set up camp and storming, but you're not going to feel very good about that and it's not going to get us any good results. So what can we do to support you to norm and then perform? But this takes a long time. Like, performing didn't happen for us until like year 6. And it didn't take but 1 or 2 changes, right? New material adoption, new changes in, oh, all of a sudden I have a bubble classroom of now I have 4 sections of this grade level to get us back to forming, right? So it is a natural part of group development. It is a natural part of implementation. Even if you just pause to acknowledge this is where we are, it feels crappy. It's the elephant in the room, right? Like you know it's there. It's lurking and it's looming. Release it. And I'm hoping this one pager will help you. Or this diagram could help you, right? Like if you're assessing professional learning, you put that one pager on the table, everyone reads it. You have chart paper or on the marker board, everyone puts a post-it note of where they feel that they are. You just created yourself a data set to talk about. How's everyone feeling, right? And then you have a conversation about that. It airs that concern out. Or you have this implementation stages up. And you say, okay, where are we feeling about this particular change and initiative? Everyone come up, and again, easier if you've got trust and relationships, people can be transparent. Where do you think we are? What are we going to do to move beyond that? Okay, so just make this a part of the conversation. One of my second grade teachers, I called her my thermometer teacher. She hated that I just kind of bestowed upon her that she was my temperature gauge. If she was cold, the whole staff was cold. If she was hot, the whole staff was hot. And so I would run to her and I'd be like, how's everyone doing? How are you doing? Okay, tell me, give me the dish. And then I gauged the staff based on her. So 1 year after I left, I get this desperate text at like 6:30 in the morning. She's like, I need help. You need to talk me off the ledge. I'm going to quit building leadership team this afternoon. We're not going anywhere. We're not moving. I'm really frustrated. It was like November. And I'm like, sweetie, well, you're storming, right? You got a new leader. You've got some changes on the leadership team. It's different. I'm like, you're storming. Have you guys talked about your stage of group development? Remember, we talked about that. We would revisit that when we had new things on our plate. She's like, no. So I emailed it to her. She was courageous. She took it to the team, and she's like, this is what I think we're feeling. Can we talk about it? And right there, it lifted. It made what everyone was feeling it just made it real. And everyone could just kind of have that opportunity to voice concern, and then they were able to kind of move past that. Okay, we acknowledge it. Let's move on. So I'm hoping this one pager can be a tool for you and your groups, but I'm hoping just to impress upon you the importance of thinking about your context in these ways. Stages of group development, stages of implementation.
I have a question on that. So when you went back to that other slide there, saying that took you 6 years to get to performing, and I don't know about any of you in here, but as teacher leaders and, admin, how do you, and hearing from Dr. Rallier, I mean, how do you sit with that as your own, just from your own personal experiences? How do you sit with that whole longevity and that duration? And what supports did you have in place for yourself to keep yourself in check as far as, we're going to get to that performance, and your own personal needs?
We were really intentional about celebrating small wins. And so we got to performing in like small areas along the way, and we would really celebrate those, and we would use those as a basis of what did we do in that other area. We brought our behavior referrals down for afternoon recess. That was our spike time. That's awesome. What did we do to get there? Oh, we restructured recess. We used our data, we restructured recess. That's a win. We have fewer kids in the office, fewer kids with office referrals. Let's now tackle this. So we celebrated small wins where we were performing. When I say 6 or 7 years, I'm saying for me, the ultimate win was when every person in that building took ownership of kids' success. And not their own kids, every kid's. And that took a while because that has to do with disposition and mindset and empowering those teachers to feel like that a collective efficacy piece, right? So we moved from conversations of, I don't know that kid's literacy data. That's Joan's kid. And I'm like, you're the 3rd grade teacher. That is your kid first, like not just the special ed teacher, right? Or the Title I paraeducator. But then I had recess supervisors owning the learning, right? As they were in the cafeteria, as they're out to recess. I had paraeducators empowered. We were doing learning with them and how they could take part in every kid's success and ownership. That took 6 years. So for me, that was the ultimate performing. So I want you to think about your learning cultures. Think about that group. You can think about other groups too, but kind of get that group that you just kind of determine what stage they might be in. And there are different types of cultures that prime the learning. So you've got school cultures or professional, okay, first of all, just because you have professional learning community on your calendar does not mean you do professional learning well, okay? And that's a facade, and we need to get real harsh about that. And I'm just saying, because I talk to enough students. This is my connection to the field, are my students, and I'm like, you call that a professional learning community? Okay, just because it's on the calendar doesn't mean you do it well. So we have, still sadly in our schools, we have cultures of isolation and individualism where people act as independent contractors. They close the doors, they do their own thing, nobody checks on them, they're very comfortable with that. You're always going to have those people. We have balkanization where you've got camps, right? You've got cliques, you've got camps, you've got some people that like each other so they might share a lesson with each other or a resource with each other, right? You've got contrived congeniality. Well, I guess because you made me get on this committee, we'll work together. Right? You've got committee work, right, which is usually delegated. And then you've got true collaboration. And that's when you have created the systems and the structures and the conditions where people want to learn from each other. And so this, in fact, can be another phase, right, depending on what you enter into. As far as, what are those conditions when you first get there, but where do you really want to move to? So this is our ultimate, right? We really want these professional learning communities where people are free to try things, comfortable with getting feedback, comfortable giving feedback, sharing, and they strive to have that community of practice. But we've got barriers, and part of our work is to bust those barriers. Sometimes we use time and resources as a barrier, or lack of time, lack of resources as a barrier. But sometimes we allow our resistors, right? Those that are comfortable, sometimes we allow our resistors to really be a barrier for our learning communities. And I could spend a whole day talking to you about resistors. But you're going to have them. We can allow them to dismantle what we try, or we can continue to move forward, really invest in not only our early adopters, but those people, build capacity with our early adopters to influence others and bring those resistors along. And I had to drag a couple. I'll be honest, I dragged them. And sometimes they left. Yep. So we talk about, right, the Jim Collins, get the right people on the bus. But once you get the right people on the bus, you got to put them in the right seats. And Derek Wheaton says, and then sometimes you have to make a compassionate bus to teach. So I will leave you in good hands, obviously, with lots of things to think about and use. But that's kind of the afternoon. So this is the what continued. What about professional learning? So the content, meaning what's the meat? What's where that foundation of what you want people to learn? So this particular section, the outcome is to think about selecting professional learning content based on evidence, based on data, based on need. Not one of those, all of those. You need to look for that intersection and that triangulation of those things to drive what you're asking people to learn about. This becomes part of your why and helps you plan for your what. So one thing we want to mention is that, of course, you should be looking at student outcome data to select content for your continuous improvement planning, but also to draw from when you're creating your professional learning planning. So you should be using a cross-section of student data. Could be some of these things in parentheticals here. Should not be limited to just those things in parentheticals here, right? Because one piece of that data doesn't give you enough information about what the whole school's adults need to be learning about or a grade level needs to be learning about. But it definitely should be consulted. So one snapshot in time, you should be basing professional learning on that. But again, the triangulation, the intersection of these different types of student outcomes. I'm so sorry I got back on my email at break to try to check off some things on my list. I will take that down when you're working. That's annoying to me. Maybe not you. So definitely student outcome. So thinking about the teams you're working with, where do they derive their student outcome? We are DRIP. We are data rich and information poor. That's one of our faults. I'm kind of exposing a lot of our faults across education, not just picking on Lenawee County. This is like across the state, across the nation. We collect a lot of data because someone told us it was important, but we don't have necessarily the right processes and systems in place to actually look at it, make sense of it, and then stop collecting some of what isn't really helpful. So definitely student evidence should be driving professional learning. Your groups may need help with that. They may need help collecting or like really having that data collected in one place, and then a process to look at what's sticking out. What are those trends? What other pieces of evidence do we have that support that we should be looking at that as a content piece of our professional learning? You should also be thinking about the adults' needs. So one of the things I mentioned was we had a huge influx of students living in poverty, more than we had ever experienced when I got to the school where I was the principal. Their need was to understand brain development of children in poverty. Like we had to dig into that so they knew that they felt more competent in how they were serving those kids. That was a data point for us. The needs of our students became needs of our teachers. The assessments that we just did above, so thinking about the PLC survey for yourself, thinking about what your RCA, DCA has to say, those can be data points and evidence that you want to draw from when you're thinking about the content of the professional learning. Some of those are perceptual in nature. Some of those have quantifiable numbers behind them. All of it's important. You got to look at the themes and the trends across many data points. The other thing I want to mention is that we oftentimes, I don't think people are thinking about, is how can we use the instructional frameworks that the educator evaluation processes are built around to pull teacher need. So all the authors of our different frameworks, right? These different eval processes and tools, Danielson, Marzano, Silver, they all created those because they believed that those were strong indicators of strong instruction and performance. They created those because they are intended to be used as instructional frameworks. Unfortunately, the messaging hasn't always been clear about that, and because then they're tied to mandates, we sometimes act out of compliance, and we do it just to get it done because someone said we have to, instead of pausing to say, oh, gosh, we can leverage this mandate to now make sure every teacher's having really powerful conversations about their practice on a regular basis, and we're going to use this instructional framework to guide those conversations. A lot of us miss that boat. So we've got to bring it back. So here's a way to bring it back to how its intended use, which is to be an instructional framework. So I want to give you a couple of examples that maybe you can use, but maybe you can help guide others to use as far as thinking about how does this process really put the emphasis back on its true purpose and can also play into the content of your professional learning. So if we think about Danielson, and in this county, you all use Danielson. So I have another one that actually looks at Thoughtful Classroom, which is Silver's model. We don't have to do that one. When we think about this particular area right here, this particular component around questioning and discussion techniques. So I'm going to give you a chance to just revisit that real quickly, the STEM here, and also how you might label a teacher and their performance in this area. I'm just going to give you a chance to revisit that. So if I was the principal of this school, and I was observing and thinking about my teacher performance as a whole school in this particular domain, and 78% of my teachers were either ineffective or developing, would this be a good place to start for content in professional learning, practicing strategies around questioning and discussion in our classrooms? Yeah, absolutely. So that is a way that you can kind of use that, but that has to be looked at across the district or across either the school or the district. Another example would be your walkthroughs. If you do walkthroughs or you do instructional rounds, those can be pieces of evidence and data based on instruction in the classroom of where content for professional learning can surface. So some people are using the, I'm just going to use the literacy practices because it's work that I'm intimate with, and they're using those to kind of guide instructional rounds. Well, if they start to see trends and what needs to be worked on, right there you have a piece of content for professional learning. Because it's not, either it's not being observed or it's being observed where it's not as effective. But these instructional frameworks can lend themselves to that as well. Now, if you had this same, if you decided you were all working on domain 3, and you had 78% of your teachers were accomplished or exemplary, then this probably wouldn't be a piece of content for your professional learning. If you had some down here, you might partner them, right? You might do some mentoring and some peer observation, some peer coaching. That's a different kind of professional learning, right? So you can still use this as a piece of evidence, the instructional framework and the eval process. I'm just asking you, I'm probing, I'm pushing on you, I'm nudging you to think about this is an opportunity for us to rework how eval is happening in our schools right now. Because it really, the spirit of these instructional frameworks were to promote professional learning for teachers, not to bring down the hammer. So this is the Thoughtful Classroom one. We won't go over that because you're not used to that. So in the next couple slides, I have where you can take the instructional frame, like some data about the instructional framework, and then how can you use that to look at what's happening with student outcomes? How can you make a decision about professional learning around those two pieces of data and how they intersect? So on the first slide, we've got middle school A. On the second slide, we've got middle school B. They both have 28 staff members, right? They're both from the Danielson, components from the Danielson. They both have similar demographics in a suburban district of Michigan. And the results were communicated through the M-STEP for English Language Arts. And Minda helped us grab this data, so this is real data, right? Not names, we keep everything. Anonymity is honored here in this space. And I don't know why that did that to me yesterday. Super sensitive when you just, Okay, close your eyes. All right, forget it. We're just gonna go look at it all at once. This is supposed to like, here, let's do this. I'm just kidding. That's supposed to fade in, but. So if you look at domain 3 again, and you look at where teachers were rated across the 28 staff members on these different part components of the domain, this is the school in which this data has been collected, the green here, across 3 years. The orange is the state average, and the purple is average of similar schools, so similar demographics. Would you say that domain 3 probably needs to be an area of professional learning content? Probably not, right? You've got teachers who are scoring highly effective or effective, and your students are up here in the 80s, right? We have big deal, 79. Come on, I lived for that data. So probably this wouldn't be an area. So again, you might be doing some things that you don't need to be doing. We've got too much to do. We've got to be really selective. Really, really important. But to be honest, only these teachers should be working on this. And you do that with some mentoring, some peer coaching, not a whole faculty, not a whole staff, professional learning. Questions about that? I didn't use my phrase. Not to deter you. So let's look at school B. So this is school B. And this is where the teachers are rated in domain 3. But this is where student data is. The green is this particular school's teacher data. And then the orange and purple are consistent from the last slide. Do you see a discrepancy there? Thumbs up if you see a discrepancy there. Yeah, well, yeah, probably, yeah. Again, discrepancies in the data can tell you a story about what the adults need and what the students need. So I think it's important that you help people that have access to this start to unpack it in different ways. Start to move beyond just getting it done to get it done because somebody expects it by a certain deadline, and get beyond just the label. How can we use it to? This part is about process. So we talked about context. What are those conditions? What are the group development, phases of implementation? Where are the conditions at for your culture of learning? Talked about content, how that should be driven by data and research and best practice and evidence-based practices. Now we're going to talk about process. So this is really this idea of tools and activities and strategies that you can use to really intentionally and deliberately plan for professional learning. So this is kind of where the rubber hits the road. Is that the cliche? I don't tell jokes well. This is where it really happens, right? So you've done all this work and thinking, and now you've got to start like really critically planning and piecing together how that's going to roll out. So we want you to think about and consider making application of these tools to facilitate, right, to really lead the learning, and how you're going to make that application to your own leadership and your own facilitation in your professional learning plans. So I'm going to introduce a lot of ideas to you. I'm going to introduce a lot of resources to you. At break, I'm going to invite you to take a snapshot of the strategy harvest, just to kind of archive all the different things we've done just in a short 6-hour period to keep you actively thinking and engaged. And then also, I'm going to encourage you, if you want one person from your team to take a picture of the resources, you can archive those as well. Some of them are listed on slides, not all of them, so I just want to make sure I always bring more than I actually think about. And I'm like, oh yeah, they'll like that too, and it's okay. So the first thing you need to think about is when you're designing professional learning, think about time, think about your structure. So this is pulling from a couple different researchers about professional learning and education. And Yoon and colleagues and company talk about a study where they look at actually several studies about summer institutes, and 8 out of the 9 of them really had effective results as far as teacher learning and student outcomes, and they were composed of at least 14 hours of learning across the summer institute. Desimone talks about 20 hours over the course of a semester or a summer, plus support during that school year, right? It's not just, oh, come for 4 days, 8-hour days, and we'll see you next summer, right? There's a way to check in. People are getting really savvy with using technology to check in, with virtual coaching, with webinars, with ways to make sure the learning is continuing and you're checking in as part of that evaluation and monitoring. So think about that. When you're thinking about structuring professional learning for the whole year, this afternoon, can you get 14 to 20 hours? And if the answer is no, when you get to your team and you're thinking, don't get discouraged, do what you can, but think about how can you advocate. Remember those standards for professional learning, one of them was leadership. How can you advocate in leadership to make sure you can build that in creative ways, whether that's the summer, start in the summer, move throughout the school year, during the school year. So we can't use time as a barrier any longer. You know, we got to think differently. We got to nudge, we push against institutional systems and ways of just doing things. And we got to start to kind of explode that a little bit and get people thinking. Because the research says this is what we need. Yeah.
I guess I just have a question. So there are 30 hours of DPPD that are required to be given by a district. Is this within that 30-hour chunk or in addition to that 30-hour chunk?
Is that a technical question?
Like district provided professional development is a requirement. So somehow during the school year, there's 30 hours that are required. So is this saying within that 30 hours, you know, as long as we're hitting that 14 to 20 is really meaningful development right there?
Yeah, I hope all 30 is really meaningful.
Well, I agree too, but I'm just saying, I agree. I'm just trying to.
It's not extra student for filling the hours.
Yeah.
So it's just within that.
So what I'm coming to understand and working with the MT team and then being here in Saginaw yesterday is you've got some choice, and with your student data, your teacher need, your DCA, your RCA, to develop the content that's needed, right? There are, yes, you have some parameters. Time spent on those so that the classroom practices can thrive. So we've got to take care of the adults, their needs, as people, as educators, as instructors, so that they can better be prepared to meet those student outcomes and student needs. One more person, a highlight of what you talked about. This is the trough. I have to mention it when I do all-day learning, that there's a book by Daniel Pink that talks all about time of the year, time of life, time of the day, and a large majority of people peak in the morning and trough in the afternoon. So I realize you're in the trough. I get it, I acknowledge it. One more person.
I think it brings it more purposeful for development and professional development, how you talked about it this morning in regards to being
Part of the
more
why.
engaging and
Yeah.
going back to that why of
Yeah.
why we're here.
Yeah.
It's not just for evaluation, it's for professional
Yeah.
growth and learning.
Yeah.
including students and principal.
And that data, as well as research and evidence-based practice, should be part of your why when you're working with a group. If you're initiating something new or you're initiating new learning for them, you gotta tie it to how did you come up with that. Part of it should be the data, and then the research and evidence should drive some of that as well. That should be your why. This should be your why as you're planning the what. But you gotta be explicit about it. You can't assume people know and understand it that way. Fist to 5, this is another strategy, right, to give me a little bit of, it's a little formative assessment. Fist to 5, think back to that group that you thought of with the PLC, conditions for learning, and the group development. Fist to 5, how much on a scale from 0, meaning none, to 5, meaning a great deal, how much do they use student data to drive professional learning? Fist to 5, just right here. You can just keep it close to you. Student data. Okay. All right, now the question, now the prompt changes. Those groups and those organizations, those groups, when planning for professional learning, how much is teacher need or adult data evidence play into the content of professional learning? Fist to 5. How often are they considering the adults' needs? Okay. Okay. It was just a quick survey for me, and so it's a little bit of a checkpoint for you. Where do you need to put that emphasis? What do you need to model for your groups? What questions do you have about thinking around data and evidence for the content of professional learning? Well, I got questions for you. So if you could pull out that metacognitive reflection sheet, it's actually listed as number 4 on the back of that sheet. Go to number 4. So this particular section, since we started up from lunch around using student and adult evidence and data and need, you can respond to these prompts. Same prompts. Your student data, your teacher need, your DCA, your RCA, to develop the content that's needed, right? Yes, you have some parameters and you've got some guidance and some obligations, right, to archiving that, to meeting the needs, but you get to decide what your needs are. Nobody's dictating what that is. This is just talking about, yeah, the structure. Yeah, if you can do more than 20, awesome, right? But it's got to be, it can't be 20 hours, 20 different topics, right? That's too much. And they're not gonna, it's not gonna be ongoing, it's not gonna be, they're not gonna get to any depth. Yeah?
I'm just curious there, I'm guessing behind those statements is something about what's in those hours, meaning is it
How are they
teamwork
learning?
or the seat time, or is it?
Yep.
I mean, I would argue sitting somewhere for 20 hours doesn't make you any more.
I would definitely encourage you to go ahead and look up these studies and dig into what did the professional learning look like? Like, how was it structured? Because I think you're going to start to see some commonalities in how it was structured. There's no way they were sitting for 20 hours,
Well,
right?
I know, but I guess to me it's more about the quality of what's in
Absolutely. So time is a factor. Structuring it is a factor. It's not the only factor. So keep that in mind. It can't just be about the time, the 20 hours. It doesn't have to be about the quality. Quantity and quality both matter in this work. So thinking about time. Thinking about, we're going to talk a little bit about agenda, and that's time within a session to think about as well. So this is across professional learning. We're also going to take it into smaller bites as well. So part of that, when you're designing, I wanted to mention a couple of resources. I do highly encourage you to hop on Learning Forward's website. They are going to not only give you just some resources to turn to, but they're also going to have a great list of publications that are through them. So this Powerful Designs book, this is really great when you're really at performing. When you're at performing, you can start to choose and select these learning designs because the trust and the collaboration, the relationships are built, because these require all that. Can't wait for the perfect context, but these are really in-depth ways to dig in, and they're designed to sustain a learning team across time. So, for instance, they talk in here about lesson study. And we got to the point where we could use lesson study as a professional learning design, even though it's a model developed in Japan and they have really different structures to their school day. They teach a little over half the time and then learn together the rest of the time. We don't have that luxury. They also go to school a lot many more days than us. So we don't have that structure quite in place, but we were able to modify lesson study as a way for us to learn across the year and go through cycles of lesson study. Really highly structured and a lot of scaffolding and direction from me at first, and then a gradual release that involved choice on their part. But this also has designs such as critical friends groups, which again, you're not going to be ready for critical friends groups if you're still building trust and getting people to talk transparently and honestly about their needs. Student voice, how to use student voice as a learning opportunity across staff. This is another one by Learning Forward, published by Learning Forward. It's Protocols for Professional Learning. What I really like about this is it's divided, it's organized by purpose. And we're going to talk about purpose. What do you want them to accomplish? What is the purpose of them having this collaborative time? These are all organized by that. So Learning Forward's a really great resource for you. Again, they're the professional organization about professional learning. So your activities, how you select your activities, that's part of your design. Again, that should be hooked to purpose. And we're going to talk about stacking some of those in a little bit. The ideas of opportunities kind of hook back to this. How can we leverage things that we know we need to do and make them learning opportunities? Staff meetings. Okay, I could, by contract, require my staff to be at 11 staff meetings a year. Ew, gag me, no. Took the 11 hours, created engaging, academic-based opportunities with families that teachers needed to be at because I wasn't making them go to staff meetings. But if you have staff meetings required, learn during staff meetings. Create that agenda where you're asking them to build trust, you're asking them to collaborate, you're asking them to read an article using a protocol, you're asking them to take a look at some data. So use your staff meetings really wisely. Professional learning communities, you heard me talk about the pitfalls and the benefits of having that on your calendar. You need to be monitoring and evaluating. We're actually going to spend some time talking about that a little bit. Your coaching opportunities, coaching is a learning design. It should not be the only professional learning design for a district or for an ISD or for a school. It's a piece of professional learning. Data dialogues. Again, one of our biggest missteps, I think, in the state was acting around the third grade reading law and the benefits of the individual reading instruction plan. I'm going to urge you to call it what it is and use all those syllables, because when you say IRIP, people think instructional, they don't think instruction, they think intervention plan, and that's not what they are. So say the whole thing. Those really, they should have been leveraged to have data dialogues about kids, really powerful ones. But instead, we all scurried out of compliance and we just got them to get them done, and we missed an opportunity to really create this opportunity to learn from each other, from a team, around student strengths and around student needs. Grade level and subject area. Maybe you have release time built into your calendars from your district for departments to meet. Don't just talk about science materials and check off the order for next year. Really, like, encourage that structure of learning to be part of that time. So that's another really important way to think about designing in professional learning. Protocols. So you've heard me talk about protocols a lot. The reason protocols are purposeful is because they're powerful. They can create a purpose for that learning. So you have to decide again, before you choose a protocol, even though it looks cool and seems fancy and you tried it once, you've got to hook it to the purpose. And a lot of these different resources, they help you think about purpose because they organize their protocols by purpose, which is super cool. So this one, Protocols for Professional Learning by Lois Easton, but this one by Lipton and Wellman is my new protocol Bible. I used to use, can you hold up teacher teams that gets results? Thanks so much, Ruth. So this is the one I used to use. It's still really good, it's great, but I actually have my students buy this one now because I like the way this one's structured. This one is organized by purpose. So do you want them really just dialoguing? Do you want them brainstorming? Do you want them making decisions? These protocols are organized by purpose. So don't just pick one to pick one. Like, oh, that's on page 30. I haven't tried that one yet. Let's go with it. Like, really put some thought into it. But here are some of the different purposes at how they're organized. Also, they're powerful because they require a cohesiveness of the group. And they build relationships. Because they are structured, because there are a set of directions, they require everyone to participate and engage, and everyone gets a voice when they're done well. Now, once you start to use protocols, you can feel free to flex them, modify them, whatever, right? Maybe you start out really stringently sticking to all the timelines and exactly the prompts that they offered as examples. But then after you start using them, feel free to make them your own. That's the idea, right? As you get comfortable, you get them comfortable with using them, and then you can go a little rogue. But the idea is it provides structure when you're designing the learning experience. Highly, highly recommend the use of some protocols. The planning part. So we talked about designing, now let's talk about planning. So in this particular section, before we take a break, I really want to think about how do you transfer some of this to learning, to the professional learning plans, and how do you embrace process? Because this is a process. This is not a fast and furious plan it the night before kind of thing, especially if you're thinking about the end in mind, which should be a year, like you should embrace the whole year, encompass the whole year. I wanted to start with this graphic. Quality is not so great. It's a screenshot of a picture from the Powerful Designs book. What I like about this is it talks about back mapping for professional learning. So just like we want to think about student learning outcomes or student learning goals when we want teachers to plan lessons, we also want to think about that as the end result for planning professional learning. So you can see step 1, you're analyzing what the students need. You're thinking about the characteristics of the school, so that perceptual data, those conditions and that culture for learning. How is that related to your improvement goals, your continuous improvement goals that should be based on the data? What do the teachers need to get better at meeting the students' needs? What does the research say? What does the evidence say about that practice? How do you plan for that learning, implement it, and evaluate it? We're going to come back to this evaluate piece in just a moment because we often forget to do this and monitor how effective what we're doing actually is. And then how do we actually try some things out and evaluate that learning as it impacts the student performance. So I'm going to talk about one quick, and you're going to see this form, this template that I created that I suggest you use. You don't have to. It's not mandated. It's just a tool for you. It's organized by the POP. And POP is not problem of practice. In this case, POP is purpose, outcome, procedures. So Purpose, what do you want to accomplish? Outcomes, what do you want? What do you want? What are the objectives for the learning? And then the procedures. What things are you going to actually do during that learning time? What activities, what tools, what protocols, what strategies are you going to try out? That's your procedures. I learned this from Nancy Coldflash. How many people are old enough like me to know Nancy? Okay, good. So she's still around. But she was a mentor, and I was a big Nancy guru. I pretty much followed her everywhere the first many years of my career. I'm still friends with her now. But as she was kind of phasing out, we started working together, and we dissected this whole POP thing. She only had this at first. Then we decided that, again, we needed to evaluate and assess the learning of the adults. So we added this plus part. And plus is assess. How are you going to assess the learning of the adults? What action steps are you going to take to make sure that you assess and follow up again? That's that ongoing support that needs to be part of a professional learning plan. So I will show you in the template how we're attentive to each of those. Before we move on with the planning, I do want to take time to delve into this idea of evaluating professional learning. Because if we're not taking time to monitor the effectiveness of our professional learning and looking at how they impact student outcomes, we're wasting time, resources, and energy. But this is not something that we do really well in the field. And probably, if you even think about continuous improvement, right, the actual evaluating and monitoring of that plan and what we're trying out sometimes falls short because our sense of urgency pushes us on to other things. So I want to take time to kind of dissect this idea of evaluating and think critically about why does it matter. In your folders is an article. It's called Does It Make a Difference by Thomas Guskey. I'm going to have you take that out. I'm going to number you off. Numbering is another strategy. If we had more time, maybe I would pass out cards or the dominoes. So there are 5 levels, as you can see up on the screen. He talks about 5 levels of evaluating professional learning. We typically only spend time asking questions to evaluate levels 1 and 2 as you're going to learn. We need to plan out our evaluations to get deeper. What I'd like you to do is after I give you an assigned number, you're going to get a number 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. Everyone's going to read the intro. You're going to read your assigned level number that I give you. There's a piece of text, and there's a part of a chart that kind of spans across 3 pages. That's just how it's formatted in this article. You're going to look at the chart, and the chart breaks down some of what's up here on the board. Everyone's going to read look for evidence, not proof. Tricky, huh? Evidence, not proof. And then working backward. So everyone reads the blue. You only read your assigned number of the orange. Make sense? Okay, I'm going to number you off. So you're not responsible for kind of delving into every level. And while I number you off, I'm going to ask you that's going to be your group when you're done reading individually to share out. Okay? But we're going to start with individual reading. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, sorry. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So you guys are a group. You guys are a group, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You're a group. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You're a group. We agreed on it, and then we used it each time we came together, tweaked it as we needed to, but then people knew what to rely on. They knew what to bring. If you have one, and you can send it out a little bit early, that also, some people won't open it, that's fine, but some people will really want to see it beforehand. So again, having an agenda is really important. In that agenda, it's important to think about the design of the day, as we've already talked about. How do you stack your strategies? So you come in with a connector activity, then you move to activating knowledge, then you move to decision making. So So you're stacking the processes within a session of learning. Fitting the strategy to the group. Again, you have to decide on your POP, your purpose. What's your purpose? What are your outcomes? And then go out and find that strategy, activity, or protocol to match. Think about your task group and your size and your composition. We talked about this briefly earlier. Are you going to have the whole staff? Are you just going to have a grade level team? Think about that. What stage of group development are they in? Do you want them moving around? How do you want them composed through the whole meeting? Do you want to vary that throughout the meeting? Because we varied it throughout today. We didn't have you just state your tables the entire day. And then, of course, time. And I say time because you want to have kind of a conceptual idea of how long it's going to take, but you also have to be flexible. And if you have to be flexible and you blow up the agenda, just own it. And just say, gosh, you guys, this took longer. I adapted things. We took breaks at different time than what the slide said. And I'm okay with that. You seemed okay with that. But just be like, this is how we're going to change things. Do we all agree? Cool, let's go. So just remember time, but don't be so tied to time that it causes you angst. And then those working agreements. Back to those working agreements. So I gave the team that protocol to select working agreements. If you don't have them, it's a nice way to start. If you already have them, I'm going to encourage you, if you haven't done so, revisit them. Make sure people still agree with them. Make sure they are alive throughout your professional learning sessions. So we used to have a set of working agreements. We would revisit them every fall. We would agree upon them. We would change some. We would have them on our agendas. We would draw attention to them. I might have a teacher read them aloud. I might have them on poster paper and everyone puts a Post-it note next to the one that they really want to focus on that day. Or they feel the team needs to focus on that day, or what's going to be really important for this, maybe application. Seeking application is the one we really got to make sure we are paying attention to today. So make them, bring them into your process on a very regular basis, or else they're just one of those things we do just to do it, because someone told me it was a good idea. But nobody wants, you make them purposeful. So I wanted to mention those reminders as you get into your professional learning planning. If you don't have an agenda, if you don't if you don't have working agreements, those are things you're going to want to start to build into your planning. So in what you'll have access to, I'm just going to switch gears and go to my computer so I can show you these examples. So one of the things that the team was really thoughtful about and wanted me to make sure I emphasize is that this is a template or a form. This is not mandated. This is not required. I think the term was function over form. So if you have something you use, please use it. This is just a suggestion. What I will ask is that in these examples, there are some prompts related to a lot of the things that we talked about when you're planning for a session or planning for the year. I just ask that you be attentive to these prompts, and if your plan doesn't accommodate for some of these things to be thought about, then you go ahead and build that into your current form or structure. So this is a plan for an actual session. So maybe it's an hour-long session, maybe it's 60 minutes, that's an hour. Oh yeah, hour and a half, 3 hours, half day, who knows? But this is for an individual session, and so what you're going to see is I have you considering who's that group, composition and size, how are you going to want them to sit, where are you going to want them to move throughout the meeting, throughout the session, and then I break down this POP, purpose, outcomes, procedures, and I give you prompts to be thoughtful about. And then I ask you to make sure you're building in how you're going to know if what you did was effective. Again, if it's just one session, you're likely just going to be looking at level 1, level 2, maybe level 3, making some projections about that. Then I give you an actual plan that you can type right into if this is helpful to you. And you can use these prompts for what you put into here. And then I gave you an example of a session, a half-day session, and who would be those people within that session, just to kind of show you how it breaks down. Again, this is no one's dissertation, but it is being really thoughtful, especially about procedure. right? So you're kind of timing things out. What do you need? What protocols and activities are you going to use? What materials do you need to have gathered up? How are you going to follow up? This is a template that you'll have access to help with a whole year's plan. So I'm asking you to think a little more broadly across time. So the POP is really for those individual. The plan is really thinking comprehensively. But you give a bit of an introduction about the group and how you want to outline things, your background and rationale. What's your purpose, your timeline? How are you going to know, according to Gusky, kind of how you're going to, what level do you want to get to as far as your evaluation and monitoring? What's your anticipated impact, your summary, and then kind of what next steps. So again, I give you a template by quarter. Again, if you have 6 meeting times, break it up into 6. If you only get to see them twice, break it up into 2. You get to manipulate this how you want. I just wanted you to have something to work from. And it definitely needs those prompts. And then again, I give you an example. I lifted this example from one of my students' examples where they get really excited and really ambitious in the summer course. So he wanted to try out 3 learning designs in 1 year. He wanted to, what does it say? I'm just giggling because I really do love him. But it was like, we're going to try critical friends groups, and we're going to do walkthroughs, and we're going to do book study. And I'm like, whoa, that's a lot, right? Like, I saw your assessments you did on your conditions for learning. You got to work on some other stuff first. But I say that this is great across 2 years or 3 years. But this kind of just shows you a little bit of what I'm thinking to just get, visual dialogue, classroom walkthroughs, and critical friends groups all in 1 year. Don't you want to be in that school? I'm kidding. So this timeline just fleshes out the classroom walkthroughs, what that might look like leading up to being able to implement classroom walkthroughs as a learning design for that professional learning for that particular staff. So just gives you an example. And again, this is way more about the process than the product. So your plan is a tool, but the process that your team goes into to thinking and designing and planning, that's the powerful practice. This should just be an artifact of that powerful practice and process. And it also, as I mentioned earlier, it should anchor your conversations with the team from the state and give you something to revisit and give you something to get coaching and support and guidance on and input and feedback. So that's kind of what I wanted to make sure that I was able to share with you before I have to take off. So I want to open it up the last few minutes for questions, because then you're going to have planning time.
On your PowerPoint, is that linked on there?
It is. It's hyperlinked, but it's also in the folder that I know is going to get shared with you. So I'm sure that they're going to go through those logistics after I go. And again, feel free to make a copy of that, make it your own, manipulate it however you want.
And you said the first one, I see the year-round, so year-round one.
Yeah, the first one was more for a session. I think the idea was spend some time thinking about the whole year, but you have access to the electronic version of that, but you get the hard copy to just take notes on. And then the other one is about the session. So if you get that far, kudos today.
When you mentioned stacking in that the one side,
Yeah.
is that reflected in the individual session planning one that you were just showing?
It has you thinking about the process. So I'm not sure that it gives, you're going to see examples of it, I think, in that particular, in the example, you'll see examples of the stacking. Can we do I'm going to do a quick formative assessment, maybe like a level 2. We're going to do a whip around the room, and then I'll add it to the strategy harvest. So I'm going to whip around the room. I'd like each person to very quickly give us one word to represent your learning from today. Just one word to represent what we've done today. And we're going to whip around the room and hear from everybody. Let's go ahead. You want to start?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, nice and loud so everyone can hear.
Feels it. Purpose.
Purpose.
Positive.
Thought-provoking.
That's pretty good for me.
Evidence.
Storming.
What's that? Interesting.
Collaborative.
Evidence.
Thoughtful.
Intentional. Connected.
Connections.
Relevant.
Trust.
Reflection.
Useful.
Resources.
Beat it.
Moving forward.
Information.
Development. Development.
Clarify.
Purpose.
Connecting. Foundational. Purpose. Transformation.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing your day with me. Everyone knows how to get a hold of me, so please don't hesitate to reach out. I wish you the best, and I'm a continued resource for them throughout the years. They support you, but if you need anything from me directly, please don't hesitate to give me a contact. Google me, you'll find my email. Don't tell me what the Google says. I don't Google myself. I have no clue, but you can find my email. All right, thank you so much, everyone. I wanted to take a picture of this.